So really happy to be here today with Professor Rhonda Magee from it's the University of San Francisco Law School, correct?
Exactly.
And it's great to see you, and I'm really excited that we're going to be co-teaching, co-leading this Engaged Mindfulness retreat this summer at Shambhala Mountain Center.
Me too. Thank you so much, and it's great to be in conversation with you now.
Yeah, absolutely. We've been colleagues for a while, working on a mindful justice initiative where we're trying to bring mindfulness in various forms across the whole criminal justice spectrum, front to back. And you've been particularly involved on the court end of that, working with lawyers, prosecutors, public defenders, and judges, and so forth. And
yes,
my organization, the organization that I'm part of, Prison Mindfulness Institute and Center for Mindfulness and Corrections, we've been a little more involved with the prison systems and reentry work, but also with training correctional officers and law enforcement and so forth. So we're starting to kind of get the opportunities to get mindfulness into the whole system a little bit here and there. That's pretty exciting.
It's very exciting. I would add that in addition to working with lawyers and law students and judges, I have done some work in communities too. And I like to think of actually, the sort of inputs and outputs of our system as encompassing, the patterns and practices which disproportionately lead to certain communities having contact with the criminal justice system, and then the policies and practices that people meet on release that make it difficult to re-enter and to re-engage in society fully. So I've been happy to be able to offer some classes, in addition to the classes I regularly teach at the University of San Francisco, but to begin opening up to offerings in our communities, especially disproportionately affected communities here in San Francisco. So we're working on it.
Absolutely. It's really, the community is the bottom line. That's all this is existing within the community. As you said, there are communities in our country that are extremely disproportionately impacted, negatively impacted by our current criminal justice system and correction system, as well as some of the other systems
yes.
that have evolved in our culture. And at the same, and not in any way to take any away from that, but at the same time, a lot of people don't realize we're all impacted by it.
Oh, absolutely.
We're all negatively impacted by it in so many ways.
It's so true, right? I mean, again, as you put it so well, it's we're all impacted, though not in the same ways. I mean, in fact, that's true even when you think about communities. Not everybody in the communities is impacted in the same ways. So to hold a sense of the complexity and the kind of multiplicity and multifaceted nature of what we mean by impact and the differential kind of ways in which that's experienced is really, I think, one of the gifts of a kind of a really deep engaged mindfulness practice, that we can actually hold deeper complexities, resist the kinds of binaries that are typically a part of conversations like this.
Well, that's a pretty good starting point. I just want to mention here at Prison Mindfulness Institute, we started using the term engaged mindfulness. Started talking about it 4 or 5 years ago, and I've been involved, and as many of my colleagues have been involved in the sort of Western Buddha Dharma movement for over 40 years now, and in particular, very engaged in what's called socially engaged Buddhism for the last 30 years or so. And that kind of has naturally, for me, evolved into this involvement with what we're now calling engaged mindfulness for 2 reasons. One, this whole mainstream secular mindfulness movement has kind of just arisen, well, by the hard work of many people like John Kabat-Zinn and many others. It didn't just arise by itself.
Right.
But certainly suddenly has arisen as an incredible societal phenomenon.
Yeah.
And at the same time, most of the work of bringing the benefits coming out of Buddhist meditation and contemplative spirituality into the mainstream ended up by nature being fairly universal and fairly secular, because this isn't a Buddhist country. And so as these practices came from these various Asian traditions, and people like myself and many others started trying to figure out, how do we bring them to prisons? How do we bring them to hospitals? How do we bring them into hospice settings? How do we bring them into work with the homeless? How do we bring them into many, many different areas where there's a lot of suffering in our society? We had to do so in a fairly universal, non-religious, open way, because this is not primarily a Buddhist culture. And so those, I think, two things came together, this emergence of this mainstream, or sometimes called secular mindfulness movement, and then the way in which engaged Buddhism naturally kind of morphed into a more universal secular delivery as well. It kind of come together, and it just seemed to be a no-brainer at some point to start talking about engaged mindfulness. And so we started a division called the Engaged Mindfulness Institute 2 years ago to start training mindfulness teachers to share the practice of mindfulness, in particular in trauma-informed ways with at-risk individuals, vulnerable communities, underserved populations, where there often is a lot of historical and present trauma. And the other first time I heard that, well, two other places I heard it. I ran to, a couple of years ago, I ran some, a gentleman has a blog. I don't know if it's active now, but it started blogging under the term Engaged Mindfulness. But the other place I heard it a couple of years ago was at the Center for Mindfulness Conference, which was, they've started alternating having the scientific conference one year, and I'm not sure what they call the other conference. It's a little more theory and academics and so forth. That one was built around ethics, and you gave this incredibly powerful presentation in which you showed some video of the African American gentleman that was unfortunately tragically killed in New York, and you used that term engaged mindfulness in your presentation there.
Oh yeah, thank you for noticing and remembering that. Yes, the particular practice that I was offering at the Center for Mindfulness at that time was around, it's a kind of adaptation of the beholding practice, where the invitation there was to really turn toward what we are witnessing or have witnessed in the form of, social media kind of representations of the kinds of engagements between individuals and, police, whether formal police or informal agents of the police, but the engagements between those empowered to use violence in communities and community members that have often resulted in some kind of violent encounter. And in the case you referenced and that I included in that presentation, actual loss of life. So, of course, this is just one example of many of the kinds of everyday incidents that more and more each of us is sort of presented with. Again, at the intersection of technology and what's happening in the world and the way we're all kind of now connected with social media, that whether we are in communities that are directly affected, right, which many of our viewers may be or are, but whether we're in those communities directly or in some degree removed from them physically, we are more and more living in kind of very hyper interconnected world via technology, and thus most of us have had opportunity to actually witness these kinds of encounters over the last several years, with increasing, in some ways, frequency as this kind of experience of using technology to capture these incidents has become a little bit more of the norm. And, so for me, socially engaged mindfulness, and a variation that I call community engaged mindfulness. But the idea here is simply, as you've already alluded to kind of build upon or sort of practice the universalized mindfulness sort of awareness and compassion modalities, these technologies for being more aware, being more present, with some kind of expanding capacity for accepting, investigating, non-attachment, just sort of being present with what is, with a certain kind of attitude of friendly acceptance, a way in which I think of what we mean by mindfulness. This work of the socially engaged dimension of it is, for me, just about recognizing that these practices do support every dimension of our experience, and not just every dimension, but becoming more aware, more present to every dimension of our experience, including not only the personal or intrapersonal work that is, I think, the primary ground of mindfulness practice, you know, sitting on a cushion or just sitting with awareness of breath and body, and ultimately perhaps thoughts, emotions, sensations, choices, awareness, expanding, right? The capacity to be present with one's own experience, so to speak. But then recognizing that the whole way we describe and tend to sort of conceptualize our own experience sets us up for this sort of notion of a divide between myself and everything else that's happening outside. Mm-hmm. And many of us, as we practice, we begin to really have a deep experience of the way in which those conceptualization of self and other actually don't fully capture what we experience. We realize the deep interdependence and interconnectedness of ourselves, the environment around us, and that brings me, and certainly, to a kind of an awareness of the interpersonal dynamics of mindfulness, and so the sort of intersystemic, intercommunal, interinstitutional, so personal practice, interpersonal practice, and then opening up to the awareness that we are, first of all, these complex systems within systems within systems, and that bringing awareness and compassion not only to our intrapersonal experience, and actually not only to the sort of concrete interpersonal social experiences, but really all of these ways in which we actually are living and breathing in the world, is what I'm trying to capture anyway by using the term socially engaged mindfulness. And again, as I say, community engaged mindfulness, which is a slight variation of that. But as I alluded to, is this idea of bringing these practices even more specifically and concretely into community engagement, into settings of groups, larger groups, with a really primary view of supporting the sense of the community, of the self, if you will, in community, and really allowing, again, awareness and compassion, mindfulness and compassion practices to maximize our capacity to be well within these social and community engaged settings.